I wonder if you know what your name means. So my name is Adam, and my name is obviously I'm named after the first man, the person in Genesis, the beginning of the Bible. My name means of the earth or of red earth, which is obviously very fitting with the color of my beard. But I wonder if you know what your name means. So tell the people around you if you don't. If you do, and if you don't, most people will find that there's a phone near enough to them that you can look it up. So what does your name mean? We're going to give you 1 minute to do that. So don't spend time on chit-chat. Let's just talk about what our names mean. Okay, so at risk of being asked if that's a daddy minute or a real minute, I'm going to call it back to order now. So I wonder if you found out any interesting name meanings. Anyone brave enough to share what their name, or perhaps someone they're sitting with's name means? Something that maybe struck you. Yeah, Tim. Gerard's name means firm spear. And Gary means spear carrier. So Gerard and Gary, you could make a team. I don't know how you feel about that, Gary, but... Soren's name means stern, strict, and severe. Soren, I would never have believed it. Anyone else? Bethany, the place Jesus loves, and July. That's lovely. So two things that those names remind us of that are wonderful things. July, obviously, traditionally, always the time when we have sun and good weather, and Bethany, a place that Jesus loved. Anyone else? Anyone else? We'll leave it. I'm going to share the meanings of... Oh, come on then, Chris. Bearer of the Anointed One. Bearer of Christ, Christopher. Which is quite a heavy burden and a privilege to own as a name. Often we don't really think about what our names mean. And sometimes we're named because it sounds nice, or because we remember someone from our younger years that we really liked or respected with that name. Or sometimes, in the case of teachers, we name people after the only name left that doesn't have a connotation of a really annoying child you had to teach. I've heard that well-worn track from many teachers over the years. Now, my children are named Boaz, and Ezra, and Liberty. And Liberty is a very easy one because her name is a word. Liberty means freedom, but not just being free to do whatever you like, but liberty has a particular connotation to be free to do something, free for a purpose. Boaz's name means swift or quick. But actually, we didn't name him because of the meaning of the word. We named him for the character Boaz in the Bible. Boaz is what the Bible describes as a kinsman redeemer, which means he redeems a situation of a lady, Ruth, who would otherwise have been destitute and not had a future at all. Ezra's name, again, we didn't name him for the meaning of it, but Ezra means, it's a little bit mixed up actually, we're not totally sure, but means God helps. But we named Ezra for the character of Ezra in the Bible, someone who calls the people of God back to God and encourages them to live in that way again. So I wonder what you would name yourself if you could choose. Now, it's not normal in our society to call ourselves something like perhaps the Native American culture do. They pick a thing and they name the person after it. It could be something like Running River. And some of these names are beautiful, but they're not the way that we approach naming. Naming is much more about a sound or a thing or a memory that we like, whereas for them they name a particular purpose or a particular thing to a person. So I wonder what you would name yourself if you got to choose what it meant, even if the words didn't sound wonderful. And that is going to be the focus of what the kids are going to spend the next possibly up to 10 minutes just doing over here, so if you're a child and you're not over there, which I don't think is anyone at the moment, then do head over there. Alice has got various bits of craft and activity, and I'm going to talk more specifically to the grown-ups, but really, as you've heard, only for up to about 10 minutes. I've got my eye on the clock. The passage that we're on this morning, we're in the middle of this sort of summer series looking at characters from the Old Testament, so the first part of the Bible, that have been named in a bit of the New Testament, a letter to the Hebrews, so to Jewish people in the early church. And there's a particular bit in this letter where it lists heroes of faith, people who gave us an example of faith in God. But the series title is Not Enough. Often, as in that's the title, it's not that the title I've come up with isn't enough, although perhaps that's true as well. But often we hold these characters up as brilliant examples that we should see and do exactly what they did. But we forget that in the context of Christianity, in the context of Jesus, Jesus really is the only one who is enough. And all the other examples fall short. Sometimes we can learn as much from seeing how they didn't do well as seeing what they did do well. This morning we're thinking about the character of Jacob, who, if you don't remember, later becomes Israel. That's his name change. And we're going to read the bit of his story where that happens. So if you can turn in the Bibles that you'll find around you or on your phone, wherever you like, to Genesis chapter 32. It's on page 39 of those Bibles. And we're going to begin reading at verse 22. And I'm going to read all the way through to the end of that chapter. So let me begin. Genesis chapter 32, beginning at verse 22. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok, which was a river. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. I'm presuming they were in a long train rather than he sort of just threw them over. So Jacob then was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said to him, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. This, brothers and sisters, is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, this is a moment when Jacob changes his name, or rather, God changes Jacob's name for him. I don't know if you know the story of Jacob, but if you have heard of Abraham, Father Abraham, we call him Father Abraham, had a son, Isaac, and Isaac had a son, Jacob, and another son, Esau. And they were twins. Esau was born first, and moments later, Jacob emerged, grasping onto the heel of Esau, which is why Jacob was called Jacob. It's a word that means holds on to, or that means follows after. Sometimes we translate it into English as supplanter. So one who comes after, but takes a hold of the person before and takes their place. And that's not the nicest thing to be named as you emerge from the womb. It's not the sort of prophecy or the positive thing that you would want to speak over your child. Now, to anyone called Jacob here this morning, and I know there's at least one, like I said before, we generally don't name people for the meanings of their names. Jacob, to the people at the time, was a word that meant what I've described. But to us today, it's a nothing word. We don't use the word Jacob in our language if we want to describe a supplanter or someone grasping on. We don't just say, oh, well, I'm going to Jacob onto you as you go up this hill so I don't fall over. That's not how our language works. We do it in a different way. But it's important for us to step into that mindset as we think about the significance and meaning of why someone was named in the Old Testament. So Jacob is given this name, and then he tricks his father into blessing him, that is Jacob, with the inheritance of the whole family over his brother Esau, who, even though it was just moments, was still legally and culturally the rightful gainer of the inheritance. He was the eldest son. Interestingly, though, that was because Isaac, their father, was really unhappy with what God had already prophesied. God had said to Isaac that Jacob, his secondborn, was going to be the one who was going to fulfill the promise that God had given first to Abraham and then to Isaac and then would follow through, to be a blessing to all nations, to save the world. And ultimately, that line of descendant follows through to Jesus through many other families. So God had already decided it, but we read in the story of Jacob and Esau and Isaac that Esau was really quite a man's man. He was the guy you would want to inherit from you. He was the hairy one, the one that went hunting. He was the one doing all the impressive things. That's who you would want your estate to go to. And so Jacob was really a supplanter. He came in and counterintuitively, but fully in God's will, was the one that took the inheritance. He then continues to grasp things through his life. And he becomes completely afraid and defined by this moment of deception of his father and gaining his inheritance over Esau, to the point where he's so worried about Esau and what Esau will do that in the run-up to this passage, he is preparing to meet Esau, his brother, for the first time in years, and he has sent ahead of him several massive gifts of livestock and treasure. And he sends all of his family ahead of him so that they might in some way advocate for him, so that when finally Jacob meets his brother Esau, Esau won't be angry any longer and won't want to kill him and take back the inheritance. Jacob has been running from Esau and defined by this supplanter name all his life. But then he suddenly realized the one he's been in a battle with, when we read this and we're told that he wrestles with a man, we're supposed to think, hang on, he's off to meet Esau and have a fight with Esau, his long-lost brother who he messed with. But instead, before he's even left, he's having a wrestle with this unnamed man. Who is this? Is it Esau? Well, no. Instead, this is the person that Jacob has really been wrestling with all his life. This is God. We believe that this is probably, I think I mentioned one of these last week, this is probably a Christophany. So there's these things called theophanies or Christophanies, which is where God appears in human form before his time. A Christophany is where Jesus appears before being born at Christmas and the cross and everything else we read in the New Testament. Jesus appears in a moment embodied in human form. And theologians would say that this is a strong candidate as a Christophany. So this is God, this is Jesus appearing to Jacob. Jacob is evenly matched with the man, but it turns out the man was holding something amazing back. Because the Hebrew here is really clear. It's not that the man punched him really hard in the hip and it caused the hip to dislocate. It's a very delicate word. It literally means to touch. He touches the hip and it pops out. So whilst it says they were evenly matched, we are to read that that is by the decision of the man he's wrestling with, not because they have equal physical stature. Jacob discovers that rather than having been in a battle all these years with his brother, in fact, he has been battling against God and what God is calling him into. Jacob took into his own hands making sure that God's promise was fulfilled. Does that remind you of the story of Sarah we heard last week, where Sarah was promised children and it didn't seem to be happening, so she took matters into her own hands? Jacob does the same thing again. And whilst he's listed as a hero of faith, it isn't until he wrestles with God and tenaciously holds on to God and demands a blessing. It isn't until that moment that he truly becomes a hero of faith. Up until that time, his life has been defined not by trusting in God, but by trying to get it done himself, even up to sending all those things, all those belongings and the rest of his family ahead of him to meet his brother so he doesn't get beaten on. But in this moment, God changes his name from supplanter or grasper of the heel to something completely different. In verse 28, "Please tell me your name," Jacob says. But God says, "Why do you ask me my name?" God is telling him that you have met me already. You know exactly who I am. He renames Jacob Israel, which means God contends or contends with God, wrestles with God. Implicitly, he is saying he is God by giving Jacob this name. But there's also an element to which is not really in the language, but an element to which he overcomes. God says, "You have struggled with God and with men, and you have overcome." But the word just means to struggle. The faith in God is the thing that helps now named Israel to overcome. His life has been a struggle, but not really with Esau, instead with God. And he begins by fighting God and ends by holding on to him. And today, as we seek for our definition, whether we're named something like red earth or something like supplanter, as we seek for our true definition, when we're baptized, traditionally, people are given a new name. That's where we get the term Christian name from. We're given a name that defines our new life in Christ. What is your name? I pray that it might be something like Israel, that you would grasp on, not to the heel of your brother who came before you, but grasp on to God and demand his blessing. It is only in God's presence that we can have that blessing, which is why Jacob won't let go until he receives it. Now, that is all really we have time for this morning. But Jacob has such a long story, and as linguistically, name-wise, he is the father of Israel. There's so much richness to his story, of course, I haven't unpacked. Specifically, some of the stuff I've spoken about today, you'll know I've mentioned before a guy called Tim Keller. Tim Keller has some wonderful sermons on Jacob where he unpacks in much more detail some of what I've touched on. Go away and listen to them. They're super encouraging. The candle's nearly gone out. I better hurry up. They're super encouraging, but they also add so much more color to the story.